on the Journal in this very last hour of the program for this Monday. So last Friday, diplomats, policymakers and foreign affairs experts gathered in the city of Kampala in Uganda to discuss the growing role of women in diplomacy and international relations. So while we can see that women are stepping into these leadership positions, the conversations looked at a bigger question. How do we move beyond representation to real influence, to real impact? As Africa's role on the global stage continues to evolve, what part of this piece of the puzzle, if you will, do women play in being able to shape the continent's foreign policy? Let's have this conversation. I'm joined on the line by media personality and public policy advocate Charity Byarugaba, who is joining me on the line, and we're going to have the conversation. Charity, a pleasure to speak to you. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak to you too.
Thank you very much. You were part of these particular deliberations that happened in Kampala. What are some of the biggest takeaways for you, Charity?
Well, last week, just like you noted in your intro, we had such an amazing conversation here in Kampala at the American Center, where we had quite a number of diplomats from the Foreign Service Commission here in Kampala, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kampala, and from the American Embassy come to explore, the women in diplomacy and how they are contributing in the diplomatic spaces, given the fact that we are increasingly seeing, more women participate in such spaces that were largely male-dominated from before. So the key takeaway for me is that while we are seeing an increase, for example, the Women in Diplomacy Index shows that there is an increase of women diplomats of 1.5% as women ambassadors at the higher positions, women ambassadors and permanent representatives. But globally, the percentage is still very low at only 22%. So it speaks a lot to what our individual countries, the different states, and also Africa, whose percentage, participation and contribution at that level is at 22%, while America and Europe are at 29%. So it shows that there's still, there's been progress, but there's still work for us to do as the different countries that are participating and are deliberate about promoting women agenda in diplomacy.
Right. I mean, we are seeing, this is such an important one because the conversation is growing, but we're seeing that women are entering diplomacy and, issues around public engagement. There's more women involved in that. But are they influencing the big decisions is the question, because it's one thing to be part of the conferences, to be part of the deliberations, but are you a big part of the decision making at the end of the day?
And that's a very good question. And this is something that we all need to pay attention to. And as I noted in the beginning, that yes, it is true. We are seeing an increase of women participating in diplomacy and all that. For example, in my country, as we speak, we have 49% of the cabinet ministers all being women. That never used to be the case. 40 years ago, we didn't have any woman in the cabinet, on the cabinet in the country. We are seeing Rwanda has over 60% of its representatives in parliament being women. Such amazing progress. But the question is that even as we see the participation or the increasing numbers of, women in those top leadership positions, the question is, what is the quality? What are the deployment positions that we see women are being designated into? It is clear and it is true that even till today, women are being deployed in the, let me call it it would be soft power in diplomacy, but when we come back home, we are still being looked at to be deployed in maybe the social, the social agendas, which people think are highly, women friendly. You'll be deployed in education, And yet we see our counterparts, the male, being deployed in energy, in infrastructure, in finance, in security. So for me, it comes back to the quality of the women and what is the readiness of the women that are deployed and that
Hmm.
are appointed in these particular positions for us to be able to make significant influence and impact in the various positions of influence. There's no doubt that we have had really significant women on the African continent that have made significant strides. In Uganda, we have Winnie Byanyima, Engineer Winnie Byanyima, the former executive director of Oxfam International,
Hmm.
South African Tuzila Malambo, the United Nations Under Secretary. They have made significant contribution, but the placements, as we see the percentage increase, the quality of placements will be very important if we are to make impactful, significant decisions that are going to influence policy at a higher level. And even the host countries, where are we deploying them? Are we
Hmm.
seeing women deployed, for example, we have representatives in the G7, in the G20, in the G7. Do we have voices there? It is not
Hmm.
until 2014 that we had the UN Security Council have 30% of them women, but largely it's been a boys' club.
Right. You're making me think about readiness and the preparation of women to take up these positions, I beg your pardon,
Yeah,
in meaningful ways, Charity. So let's look at
yeah,
how perhaps the skills that are needed for today's, feminine leadership and diplomacy work. What are the skills that are needed today that perhaps were not as important in previous regimes?
yeah. Just like we have noted before, that the center stage has been very massacring.
Mm.
It was shaped up by, the assertiveness, the male factor, and, coming from largely the hegemonies of this world, which are largely capitalist and, having very less gender considerations or space for gender and all that. So we see that we are coming in a space which has been previously or even today highly masculine. And nations, individuals, and the different engagements hoping or
Mm-hmm.
thinking that women need to be that women will come on board, but they will come in maybe more so in a humanitarian perspective, which is very okay because
Yeah.
humanity is gender sensitive, at the end
Mm.
of the day. But now where we are looking at a totally different trend. Diplomacy has moved. There is a huge transition from the formerly state to state engagement. We are seeing business interactions. We are
Mm-hmm.
seeing technology. Recently, you saw President Trump visit China. And what did he do? He went with a huge delegation of business leaders, top business leaders from America and business executives. And what does that signal? What does that speak to
Mm-hmm.
the rest of the world and us? That there is a shift in diplomacy. The world is now talking commercial diplomacy, economic diplomacy, transactional diplomacy, tech diplomacy, and all that. So for us women to be able to be positioned in a place where we can add significant value, where our impact can be felt, it's important that our governments put up structures, frameworks that empower, that equip, that deliberately, align or train women who are going to come into these spaces. You're talking about technology.
Mm.
What, I mean, which women do we have in Uganda? If I'm to give an example of my
Yeah.
own country, which women in Uganda do we have that are in that tech space that have the capacity to actually impact a shift
Mm.
at a global level,
Yeah.
beyond the borders? How many women do we have in South Africa who are in energy, who are influencing energy,
Yeah.
who are influencing infrastructure. So all African problems are the same, I should say.
Mm,
We are
mm,
struggling with poverty, we are struggling with low education levels, access, ignorance, and therefore, if we are to solve the challenge of women, going up the ladder in diplomacy, we must first deal with these foundational challenges that we are having in our respective countries at that level. Then we are sure that progressively the women that are being nurtured from our very own countries
mm.
have built the capacity. They have what it takes to sit on on the same table as
Mm.
equals with the rest of our counterparts.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness, so much to think about, especially with the mention around really what it is that we're doing to strengthen the voice of women on global stages when it comes to the influence of public policy, as it were. In conversation with Charity Byarugaba, who is a public policy advocate herself. She's a media personality, and we're talking about the deliberations that happened between the diplomats, policymakers, as well as foreign affairs experts as they gathered in Kampala in Uganda. We take a break and return.
The voice of the continent, now online, with all your sports fixtures, lifestyle, and more. Conversations are happening, and Channel Africa is at the heart of them. We tell the African story with clarity, pride, and purpose, reaching audiences that matter to your brand. Partner with us and connect your business with listeners across borders in multiple languages and markets. For partnership opportunities, sponsorship, or sales, email us at partnership@channelafrica.co.za. Channel Africa, the African perspective. The Journal with Mateko Musito. Catch it on the Channel Africa app, SABC Plus, and on channelafrica.co.za. Weekdays from 9 till 12 p.m. Central African Time.
24 minutes into 11 a.m. in Central African Time. We continue our conversation, look at the roles of women in public policy influence. And the real kind is what we're talking about here with Charity Byarugaba, who joins me live from Uganda, and we really are talking about the deliberations that happened to really bring up the voices of women in meaningful ways. Charity, you added another layer to this conversation that I think is quite critical. Just looking at the various levels of diplomacy. And humanitarian work is very important, especially on a continent like ours, where we need to, constantly have community upliftment projects, education projects, projects that talk about food sovereignty and really uplift policy in that manner. And the roundtables that are being held, through the efforts and facilitation of women. But moving beyond humanitarian work is very challenging, if I could use that term. How do we do that with all the education and the expertise and the deliberations that we have amongst ourselves as women? How do we move beyond doing humanitarian work to really being to sit at the table and to make public policy something that is not only the business of everybody else, but where women are upholding the supremacy of their constitutions and making a difference?
Yeah, thank you very much. And once again, you raise a very important aspect that I think we need to really look at keenly, because when you look at the women participation in politics, in governance, and all that in diplomacy, and when we look at the numbers statistically, they look like they are amazing, they look at that. And
Mm-hmm.
but then it does not just end at that. Women's influence, women's leadership influence should not just affect social policy, should not just, be counted in humanitarian work. It should be able to influence the economic or the fiscal policies that are key or core to the development agenda of women. For example, every time you talk about wars, in Uganda, I think we have had war experiences like in the late 80s and then 90s up until the early 2000s in northern Uganda, where we had over a 20-year war with the Lord's Resistance Army. But I can tell you that the most affected are the women and the children. You look at any insurgency, you look at any war, there will be the women, there will be the children.
Yeah.
And then humanitarian aid will come in at that. But I think that is not all. We can go beyond that. And how can we do that? The women that have been trusted with these leadership positions, the women that have risen the ladder and they are holding, the different positions in whatever country or at a higher level in diplomacy, it's important that we consider gender responsive budgeting, not just theoretically, not just as a technical exercise, but something that can be able to carry the heaviest burden, address the heaviest burdens that women face of poverty, of unpaid care work. That is most of the challenges that women in Uganda and Africa largely do face. The economic insecurities that affect us, the wars, the health care. In Uganda today, our maternal mortality is around 189 deaths per 100,000 births. That is still high compared to the UN target of 70, less than 70.
Yeah.
And then sub-Saharan Africa has the highest percentage, for example, of maternal mortality rate of over 70% to the global percentage. That is pretty high. So the women in the policy levels, the women that are on these decision tables, their ability to translate the genderness, to engender the budget, to engender the decisions, to engender the frameworks, to engender the education frameworks, the health frameworks, the implementation frameworks. I think that will be core and that will be critical for us to be able that we are moving from, what we have largely been known of, as, the soft ones, collegial. That is okay. All that is okay. But we can go beyond that. Can we influence policy? And if we have grown from a level of just being political appointees, or, I would want to call it tokenism, if we grow beyond that level of being political appointees or tokenism, and we get to a level where our voices are heard, where we have the skills, we are able to unite in purpose and be able to let the decisions be made that are engendered enough to have the women issues addressed at a higher level.
This is such an important conversation. It's definitely not a one-time conversation. I would love to have you return so that we can continue. I think there's several other, matters to discuss, especially when we look at how the roles of women in these leadership positions can help us to speak in a united voice, especially internationally. There's conversations around reparations right now. And I think if we were to speak with one voice as the continent, we'd be able to tackle that so much better. But there's so much to unpack. Charity, this was really, really important. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much. Charity Byarugaba joining me in her capacity as a media personality and public policy advocate. Very important conversation on the roles of women in diplomacy and their influence in public policy, as it were. It's 11:30. We check in with the latest in sports. What's happening? Figile Lungwati standing by.
Sports.